Well, welcome. As Phil said, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jeanne Norris. I know both of you, so happy to see you again. And I'm leading a monthly series based on the STEM teaching tools resources developed through the ACESSE project. There will be a December webinar. It's going to be on Resource D, which Phil can share the topic of Resource D, I think, better than I can. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just like thumbnail sketch. So Resource D is kind of a day-long professional learning sequence. It is actually very comfortably done in a 2-day sequence around developing a 3D assessment item cluster. So it is like, how do you actually build a 3D formative assessment that would layer into an instructional unit that kind of holds like the framework vision, but is like, a batch of questions around a phenomena or design challenge. So that'll be on deck for December. So spread the word.
Yes, but yes, thank you for joining us today.
So this particular resource, so Jeanne and I are going to kind of open up a version of it. It is one of our open education resources that we publish on stemteachingtools.org. And so it goes by the resource C label on the website. C shorthand for culture. And it really is like one of these really powerful instructional practices around centering the lives of students and community in science instruction. Mm-hmm. It comes from a slightly longer collaborative history. If you go to the next slide, Jeanne, we have a kind of a decade-long partnership with the state science supervisors across the country, trying to build equity and coherence across that network of networks. And this particular resource came pretty early in our collaboration, and kind of Shelley Stromholt was on our team at that point. And we worked with Tiffany Neal from Oklahoma and Sam Shaw from South Dakota. They were in their science ed supervisor roles at that point in time, no longer are. But they helped us design this lesson, and we had lots of feedback from our broader network of supporters in that space. We do center this work around equity, justice dimensions of the work, which includes kind of understanding how we can be better advocates and supporters of Indigenous self-determination. I work at the University of Washington. The university kind of works on the lands and waters of the people who identify as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip peoples. These are Coast Salish peoples here, and there are other Indigenous peoples on these lands. And part of what you'll see today is like, we'll do some more examples that go in a direction of understanding what the cultural life within Indigenous life worlds, how that relates to science education. And we'll do one particular deep dive to kind of think about that work. But more generally, we need to hold kind of this frame to think about how we're doing this work on the lands of these ancestral peoples that are ongoing nation states that are in the US.
All right, thank you, Phil. So I see more people have joined us. So in the chat, if you could please let us know your name, location, and role in science education. And just as you're doing that, just want to remind you, please meet your needs as they arise during this session. If you need to tap out for a little bit to have a bio break, feel free to do that. We're going to put the link for the slides in the chat as well. And you can access the base resource on our stemteachingtools.org website, /PD/session-C. So we'll just see who's in the room.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Yep, glad to see you. If you're just joining, we can get the slides in the chat one more time. And so just to give you some overall session goals, so we hope to learn how to promote equity and social justice as the focal point of standards implementation work by focusing on learning and teaching as an inherently cultural process. And we're going to develop a shared understanding of how cultural formative assessment can reveal the interests, experiences, and identities of students, and understand how and when to use the different kinds of cultural formative assessment to guide instruction and overlap the curriculum with the lives of the young people we teach.
So today's resource that we're kind of opening up is ACESSE Resource C. That is the base resource underneath today. It actually is more extensive than what we'll do in today's 90-minute session. It typically runs in about a half-day professional learning kind of series or event. I think it really is quite powerful as a kind of an approach to thinking about how do you overlap science instruction with the lives of youth and communities that you're serving. And we'll kind of open up this one particular practice called self-documentation. If you go to the next slide, Jeanne. Self-documentation is really kind of helping students open up their life worlds in ways that they want to share with others in the learning space. Things that relate to particular topics or phenomena or practices they engage in. And so this particular set is kind of in the collection of materials of Resource C. It's a fifth grade kind of microbiology of human health unit where kids are self-documenting the health and wellness practices from their home life to kind of open up and guide instruction. So it's a really general approach, and we'll put lots of different ideas in play around this. I did want to kind of start today with a bit of an origin story for this approach. It started about 17 years ago here in Seattle. We had a collaboration with an elementary school in Southeast Seattle for about 10 years, where we were working with teachers and administrators and community members there on opening up culturally kind of responsive science instruction in the 4th and 5th grade. This is a part of the city. If you've been to Seattle, it is kind of opposite and a little bit south of downtown, to the east of downtown. And it runs alongside an industrial river, which is a Superfund site over the past 20 years, formally so, and ongoing work to try to remediate the effects of the decades of pollution that started in industrial settlement of Seattle, and then during World War II went really deep around kind of our role in the military history of World War II production. So, but the ongoing effects are present. And so just to kind of put a thumbnail sketch on that, so for youth that are growing up in this neighborhood, they have about 6 to 8 times as much of a chance to have childhood asthma than other kids in the county. So it does have very particular personal health consequences. This is an image from the classroom setting. It's an open concept school of that era. So there are no walls between the classrooms. So you kind of go through pods of multiple classes next to each other. This is a 4th grade site where we were starting to do our work. And if you open up the next sequence, we were studying their use of kind of a commercial science inquiry kit, the food chemistry kit at this time, and particular youth that we were working with and them and their families. We were trying to understand how they were engaging in science learning as part of the school day. And in particular, the story I'm going to tell is about Brenda, who you'll see in just a second. And she pretty systematically does not engage in the practices of systematic mixing that are in this particular chemistry inquiry unit. She's opting out of that instruction. At this exact same point in time, however, Brenda is routinely engaging in that practice at home through practices of perfuming, often almost ritualistically with her mother that she lives with, and they kind of go through this for almost a year, kind of a perfuming practice on the weekends. And it has incredible desirable features in the practice, they're controlling for contamination in the materials, they're doing systematic testing of different trials, they're journaling those results. So things that you might like to see in the classroom, she's actually engaging in at home around this other purpose. And I think if you only saw Brenda at school, you wouldn't know that she wants to be a chemist or a paleontologist at this point in her life when she grows up. But she's very much science identified, but that's not how she gets seen at school at this point in time. We were partnered with the teachers then to do culturally responsive work around their science curriculum. We took the MicroWorlds kit from STC that had been adopted at the district level, redesigned it to give kind of a purpose to it by focusing on human health related concerns and microbiology specifically. So we did kind of engage in parts of the commercial kit, but we did other very kind of culturally grounded investigations as well, which you'll see as we open up. And those cultural investigations related to microbiology of human health came from the self-documentation practice that we're going to get on the table today. The thing to note here is that during this time period, Brenda, when we were doing the culturally engaged approaches to science instruction, her position and how she engaged in science deeply shifted, and she started to show her science identity and interest and expertise in the classroom space. So that cultural connection reframed how she engaged in learning. So, even though this was all taking place before NRC framework for K-12 science ed had even been thought about, it is very much related to the three-dimensional model of science learning that's in the framework vision, and we'll actually broaden that to think about a five-dimensional model in just a second. But Brenda and her colleagues were, engaging in science and engineering practices in these sustained investigations, and as that process unfolded, she was developing an understanding of disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts related to systems in that particular example. And it really is like this powerful shift in how she is presenting herself as being science identified within the classroom site. So we're going to stop and try to really think about like, well, why did she bring that version of herself into the classroom space, and how can we have that more systematically happen for all students? This experience and others like it have informed a whole set of resources on the STEM teaching tool site that centers science teaching and learning as a cultural endeavor. This particular resource very much came from kind of analysis of the groups in that space, including Brenda and others, and shows that we can actually think about formative assessment from cultural perspectives and not just cognitive perspectives, which are much more common in our field. And so we kind of have built out, I think, about 24 STEM teaching tools that are specifically about cultural dimensions of science learning and teaching. So this is just one example of many that are in the broader collection.
All right, thanks, Phil. And I did put the brief link in the chat in case you're interested in reading it if you haven't already. So science learning is happening across settings. So to build on interest and identity, we have to take into account all of the places where learning happens across student lives. So in addition to school, this includes places other than school, like everyday settings and family activities, like Brenda's story that Phil shared, designed informal settings, and out-of-school programs. So all significant learning is supported by multiple institutions, and different environments are going to support different related forms of science learning. So helping learners coordinate their learning across settings is a core equity strategy. And we can just share a quote from the framework here on why it's so important to build on prior interests and identity. So instruction that builds on prior interests and identity is likely to be as important as instruction that builds on knowledge alone. All students can profit from this approach, but the benefits are particularly salient for those who would feel disenfranchised or disconnected from science should instruction neglect their personal inclinations. So again, thinking about that wonderful case study of Brenda. And another idea from the framework about community connections. So a major goal for science education should be to provide all students with the background to systematically investigate issues related to their personal and community priorities. And we see this, the framework is asking us to do 3D learning, like Phil was saying, where students learn to figure out how to explain and model phenomena. And it's engaging students in making sense of the phenomena through sustained investigations. But maybe really what we need is 5D learning. So including those elements of interest and identity. So because we want to stay focused on issues of equity in science instruction, we have to consider not only the 3 dimensions, but also interest and identity, because those 2 things are mentioned in the framework every time the 3 dimensions are deeply discussed. And they are one of the 5 guiding principles of the vision for science education. So cultural formative assessments will take interest and identity into account in shaping instruction. And there's a whole resource, resource A, where there is a webinar recording of this resource too, if you'd like to do a deeper dive. But it talks about the 4 different models of formative assessment intervention. And we can share the link for you in the chat of that resource and the webinar recording. But today's session is going to focus on cultural formative assessment, which is less common than cognitive formative assessments. And you've probably seen, data-driven decision-making happening. It doesn't really include any deep examples of student work or a sense of how students might be struggling or what to do about those students who are struggling. And it also, this data-driven decision-making doesn't really employ an explicit theory of student learning, such as behaviorist or cognitive or social. And it's worth noting that well-designed studies that have tested this intervention approach have not proven effective in improving student achievement outcomes like we hoped they would.
And just to pop in and say, so there is very little evidence that it leads to improvement, and yet so many federal dollars go in that direction. So just to name that particular struggle that we all need to engage in, like it gets a lot of time and attention, but it actually isn't showing signs of improvement. So that's kind of,
definitely
an important thing to worry about.
It's very important. And please do check out that session A on our website because it really goes more deeply into that. But, cognitive and cultural processes do have, some promising evidence that they actually do help student outcomes. And so we're going to specifically dive into the cultural formative assessments today. So now that we have a sense that all science learning is a cultural accomplishment, let's think about the role of formative assessment in classrooms. And so I'm going to turn over to Phil for just a minute here.
Yeah, so we, throughout the work of the past decade supporting kind of the framework vision in science ed, we've really tried to hold on throughout all the work that we do in equity and justice framing. So this particular quote comes from a designer, Donald Caduto, that the most important thing is to keep the most important thing. The most important thing is to keep the most important thing, the most important thing. In the sense that it's so easy for the equity and justice dimensions of the work that we do to slide to the background or even off the table completely. And so part of what we try to do is very intentionally thread it through and make sure that it's centered in all the work. So we're going to open up the equity dimensions of cultural formative assessment, and then we'll sink into some worked examples of students in just a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those dimensions are outlined in chapter 11 of the framework. So this is the table of contents of that. And so these are all relevant to formative assessments, thinking about how do we equalize opportunities to learn? How do we make our science instruction inclusive, where we see learning as a cultural accomplishment, where we relate youth discourses to science discourses, where we build on that prior interest and identity and leverage their cultural funds of knowledge. And that also includes making diversity visible in STEM and valuing multiple modes of expression. And back to Phil.
All right. So, as I'm 30 years in on working on public education related things and science ed. And as I think about how we've emphasized different perspectives on teaching and learning across a few decades, I do think the social cognitive focus has gotten a lot of attention in very productive ways. I think you can see that rippling into the storylining work that happens, pretty broadly these days, and other kind of anchored instruction inquiry models and different approaches. I do think part of what we were trying to do in the framework and in chapter 11 specifically was to highlight the cultural dimensions of learning in addition to the cognitive. So they intersect and they kind of add to each other. But from this perspective, all science learning can be understood as a cultural accomplishment. So what counts as learning and what types of knowledge are seen as important are closely tied to what a community values and what is useful in that community context. So the ways of organizing science inquiry in Southeast Seattle to take into account the health-related dimensions of what microbiology relates to wellness in that particular context becomes a really salient, important thing to sink into, just given the very particular lived realities of how cultural life shows up there, given the history of that part of the city and the communities that live there. So trying to dial into those details is what we're trying to open up. The PD session for today really has these three pieces. So we'll get kind of an image of culture on the table. Second phase, we'll think into a work example. And then the third phase, we'll talk about how this might relate to your practice as a third phase. So in this definitional sense, we want to kind of highlight this idea that, culture is not a trait. It is something that we all live because we're all cultural beings. We all spend time across communities engaging in very specific ways that are related to values and practices that are showing up in those spaces. And we'll do some reflection on that in just a moment to kind of think about the cultural communities that we engage in. Culture includes the ways in which human beings engage and make sense of the world together as they participate in everyday activities of our communities. I was just coming from a anthropology conference session this morning that was about understanding how friendship operates in different parts of the world and how people make sense of their kind of social life and their political life through friendship groups in very specific ways. And that's just like a very beautiful example of like how we organize ourselves to make sense of the world and like figure out how we want to take action. Culture from this perspective reflects these socially and historically organized ways of living and making sense of life. And we often in our resources, we'll call these sense-making repertoires because they are multifaceted. They're a repertoire of ways. And if you want to kind of really go deep in that direction, access resource G on our website is like really a way to kind of understand the variety of sense-making practices. And then often it's important to realize that the cultural worlds of youth from non-dominant communities are very frequently seen from a deficit perspective, like they are the ones who hold culture and it's a problem, rather than being a source of increased rigor and relevance. So part of the asset shift that we're trying to make within this framing is to understand, well, we all have cultural lives and we need to center that in ways that recognize that power dynamics sometimes play out in ways that some of those cultural lives are not brought into focus and made central to our learning and becoming, scientifically literate. So in case it's helpful, this is a kind of a technical definition of culture. It's a term that has many different possible meanings in the literature. But within the learning sciences field, where I spend time, my colleague Naila Nasir and colleagues came up with this definition at about the same time we were doing that work in Seattle, actually 15 years ago, and it's kind of continued to kind of guide our thinking. So I'd encourage you to kind of think about the kind of cultural communities of yourself and your students as I kind of read this definition. So by culture, we mean the constellations of practices communities have historically developed and dynamically shaped in order to accomplish the purposes they value, including the tools they use, social networks with which they are connected, ways they organize joint activity, and their ways of conceptualizing and engaging with the world. So those different dimensions probably point you into different directions as you think about the cultural lives of your students or yourself. And so we're going to stop and pause and just do a little bit of reflection on our own cultural groups that we belong to at work, in your personal life, in your communities. One heuristic, if you're a little bit stuck on trying to name your cultural communities, when we were doing this resource in person, in Oklahoma, actually, somebody said, oh, I just realized that my Facebook groups are kind of all these different cultural communities that I participate in. And so like, that's not the only place where you engage in cultural work, but like if those group affiliations are helpful to you, it might give you a way in to kind of name some of these cultural communities that you participate in. So Jeanne, with that, I guess I wonder, anything else to say before we have people do the reflection and pop into a group?
Yeah, I just want to revisit the idea of deficit perspective.
Right.
If that's okay to do right now.
Sure. Yeah. So often, so you could imagine that in a situation, at least in a lot of, contexts of the US, people who are thought to have different cultures than what is thought to be important for education, those different cultures are students that are either people of color, people from poverty impacted communities, where their cultural life is seen to be at odds with the goals of what you're trying to accomplish in the learning environment. And so often these stereotypes of particular groups not being interested in science, or not doing things that relate to science, or not being interested in education generally, these kind of deficit frames are circulating in just all sorts of problematic ways. And the asset-based move is trying to understand, like, oh no, we all actually live diverse cultural lives that we can understand how they can connect to making sense of the natural world in science ed. And so it's like understanding that if you come from, for example, another part of the world and your family immigrated here and you have a long history in your family of doing particular kinds of subsistence agricultural practices, that's a resource for science learning in a way that connects very directly to what happens in Southeast Seattle, but also like is more of a cultural fund of knowledge that is something that can be mobilized and not seen to be somehow pulling you away from what is important about the science that we're trying to learn through this unit, which may or may not line up with kind of how that community thinks about their farming practices, for example. So lots of different examples there. I think I'll stop and pause. It looks like might have gone enough. Okay, excellent. Well, let's have you reflect on your culture groups. And I think Jeanne is just going to pop you into, I think, one breakout room, and you'll share a bit with each other about the cultural communities that you participate in. And then we'll bring you back in just a minute.
Okay. Yep.
All right, welcome back. We decided to do really small introductions, so hopefully you got to know another person a little bit kind of in depth around their cultural lives. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. Maybe in the chat, you can share one or two cultural communities that you mentioned in your breakout, if just to kind of help the broader group know what groups people were just talking about. I think one thing that comes up in these examples, especially for science educators, is like, did you include something as a cultural community that relates to science as part of a cultural life for yourself? And so all science educators participate in the cultural endeavor of science. We don't often talk about it that way or think of ourselves in that role, but we want students to make that science connection. And so trying to make sure that science teachers are also making that connection to science cultural communities is an important reminder in that space. So within kind of this framework that is from the learning sciences, in this cultural view, learning and development can be seen as this acquisition throughout the life course of these diverse repertoires of overlapping, complementary, or even conflicting cultural practices. So you can think of, if you think about the Brenda case in particular, that particular systematic mixing practice that she's doing around perfuming, that she doesn't bring to school initially, but then ultimately does, is actually tied into a longer history within that family, where they do particular kind of as kind of Haitian immigrants to the U.S., they engage in very particular styles of cooking across kind of in intergenerational ways with the grandmother and themselves and with Brenda, that involves systematic mixing in very specific ways. And so in the deeper cultural experience of Brenda, mixing becomes like one of these practices that's similar or different across the settings of her life. But it is kind of this through line of like, how she's thinking about science, and this interest in becoming a chemist is like tied to this family history around cooking and mixing, actually, in a very direct way. So we can kind of think about that kind of work in lots of different other ways. Another young person comes to mind from that same school. Sam was a kind of a deep builder of many things across like the time period we were there, and it started from a summer program where he was like doing a 1 week bionicles program that just in the 3rd grade he fell in love with, and then for the next 10-15 years of his life, like design and engineering have opened up for him. So that practice of design related things is similar, different across the settings and the communities he participates in, but it's important to understand those connections so that students can think of engineering as being something that they may want to explore. Sam did not make that connection until middle school, and he kind of understood that his love of design actually related to this whole field of people who do that for a living. And so like stories like that are ways that we're trying to expand the cultural pathways for students. So in terms of naming specifically how this shows up in science education, the cultural perspective on teaching and learning could relate to a range of different things. And just to kind of name some of them, it could shape how students experience, observe, and narrate phenomena. Those are all cultural practices in that lived life-wide way. It can shape to what extent they find particular scientific topics salient or interesting. I think that probably is something that we all feel, like we're all culturally interested in probably some parts of science more than others. Culture can help us understand how familiar students are with design and working through failure. So you think about Sam. Sam is unflappable in moments of design failure because he's like years in on a design identity where that's just thought to be part of the learning process. But other students may not have that same cultural background, and actually when their design does not work, it can actually lead to kind of an emotional crisis, actually, as they think that they're being judged for something that isn't working. Cultural perspectives can help us understand how students communicate and how they engage with elders or the knowledge of elders. That's all culturally variable and rooted. It can also help us understand how students pose questions or engage in argumentative and explanatory talk and writing. And so then the question is, are we opening up approaches that are generous to the variable cultural ways in which students are expressing their understanding through arguments or explanations or models? So the research is clear that cultural diversity benefits science itself, and it benefits science learning. And there are long kind of research lines of work that document that contribution. It's crucial to actually approach the different cultural ways of knowing that youth bring to science as an asset, like we were talking about earlier, and trying to not erase or minimize the cultural lives of students, but actually to acknowledge and recognize and affirm their cultural lives. And so that shift is something that we are trying to foreground, and at the same time often is at odds with how maybe curriculum materials are written, which may or may not actually center cultural diversity as a focus of learning together. So we're going to sink into kind of a worked example, as I was talking about at the top of the session. So we will drop the link here. I think I have it handy. So STEM Teaching Tool 11, the quick backstory on this was that as the framework came out and then the Next Gen Science Standards came out the next year, and Appendix D, focusing on all standards, all students, was continuing the thinking around equity aspects of the vision. The case studies that show up in Appendix D did not highlight Indigenous communities as a specific community of focus. And so Megan Bang, a good colleague of mine who's now at Northwestern, who was here at University of Washington at that point in time, we decided to sink in and do some resource development specifically around science education and Indigenous community interests and goals. And so this resource is really a fundamental kind of overview of how the cultural lives of within Indigenous communities can be connected to science ed in specific ways. So we're going to do something a little bit odd. We're going to stop and do some individual reading just for 4 or 5 minutes as we get these ideas on the table, and then we'll come back together and kind of make sense of like how this relates to the work we have on deck for today. Okay, so as we kind of make sense of this particular resource and kind of the cultural dimensions, it's worth saying that I think one of the tensions that Megan and Marissa were navigating as they were writing it was to name some practices that do span across Indigenous communities without actually saying all Indigenous communities engage in specific practices, which is that kind of essentialization of a cultural community to be a static image of one way of being is at odds with how we understand culture to operate. And so at some level, every Indigenous community has its own way of taking up these practices. They are pointing out things like observation and storytelling and knowledge residing in very particular places as some key things that often are operating within Indigenous communities. But the ways that they specifically happen might be quite unique and tied to that context and community. We have, it is Native American Heritage Month here in November. And so we've been kind of extending this work to try to provide lots of different detailed examples of what this can look like. So in the resource collection I just dropped in the chat, there's over 140 examples of what it looks like to actually understand science education or work in STEM from an Indigenous ways of knowing perspective. And each one is kind of very specific. And then there are some resources that provide more general background, like the brief is also doing. There are lessons and videos and thought pieces and articles about like anti-Indigenous racism. There's like lots of different things in this particular collection. And so I encourage you to explore it and find pieces that are relevant to your context. It's a way of centering a worldview that is not a dominant worldview and to try to figure out, well, how do we do justice to kind of supporting the goals and interests of Indigenous communities that are in our community and actually more generally. So with that, we're going to transition to kind of the next piece, which we're going to start making the pedagogical shift towards how do we take this into account. And Jeanne is going to open up the shift towards teaching.
Thank you, Phil. So thinking about some educational implications of all of this, a culturally responsive approach to science education involves recognizing community practices and knowledge as being central to the scientific endeavor. So in that spirit, we were thinking we might do a Jamboard activity. So we can put the Jamboard link in the chat in just a moment here. But in this activity, I want you to think of a science topic and a community you are deeply familiar with. And how might that community sense-making practices, knowledge, and interests help frame the topic? So I'm going to give you an example. So the example that I have is about Pokemon. So my son loves Pokemon. And if you know anything about Pokemon cards, they're like little cards with these mythical creatures on them. But the mythical creatures are often like related to a real life creature. And so they often even have like names that are similar, and they have these abilities in battle that are a lot like the adaptations that the real life organisms have. So Pokemon players know that different Pokemon have special physical and behavioral adaptations to help them survive battles. And I thought that that could be really helpful if you're thinking about evolution, natural selection, and adaptations. So on this first Jamboard slide here, slide 1, if you could pull up a sticky note and type an example of your own of a science topic and a community and how that community sense making might help frame the topic. And Phil has the Jamboard link in the chat. Thank you. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to think of, if you can think of more than one example, that's awesome too. And if you don't know how to use Jamboard, if you would rather just say your example out loud, you're welcome to do that too. So the way that you use it is you pull up a sticky note. It looks like a square. Okay, so we see some coming in. So farming. So if you live in a farming community, you'll have lots of knowledge to bring about life cycles, weather and climate, the hydrosphere, and technology. People in the running community have deep knowledge about human functioning, metabolism, and diet. And your aging friends might have lots of evidence about healthy life choices. And there are lots of examples too on the second page from our previous session that we held for this. So thinking about cooking and the needs of organisms and how to create different flavors and tastes. A lot of people mentioned athletes, so you mentioned runners. A lot of people mentioned athletes. A lot of people did mention gardening and farming. So just so many ways that we can bring in our students' knowledge to the table because of the cultural communities that they are a part of. So there is a STEM teaching tool that discusses the pitfalls of culturally responsive instruction that we can put in the chat, STEM Teaching Tool 53. And so we're not going to read it right now, but I am going to cover some of the key parts of that. So pitfalls to avoid when engaging in this work: do not assume that specific cultural groups engage in certain practices. Don't essentialize or stereotype them. Do not send the message that the dominant culture has no culture, like it's just normal. Don't ask students to shoulder the burden of representing their culture. So no individual speaks for their culture, race, or gender. Do not make token references to the history of cultural groups, and instead interweave cultural history, present and future, more deeply into instruction. And then avoid the epistemic injury of students. So basically what we mean by that is, like, students are coming with a lot of cultural knowledge to the table, and we don't want to just be like, well, no, science doesn't agree with that, you're wrong, because that is never a way to build a bridge and make people feel included. So avoid that epistemic injury.
Can I give a worked example that just showed up? So I was in a session where we're doing a lot of climate and environment related work right now. And basically we're trying to understand in this group conversation about what was ecologically happening in this particular space where there's increasing drought and mega fires. And the scientists in the room had particular ways of putting explanations on the table about what was changing. There was an indigenous elder there who opened up kind of a multi-decadal story of what's been changing. And at some level, like, that rooted story in place over decades could either be thought to be a relevant piece of knowledge or even a science explanation or not. And so I think that's like an example of adults navigating the same issue of, like, what knowledge are we kind of supporting in the space, or where do we cause injury by pushing a piece of knowledge out of the space, saying, well, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the whole, the full explanation that sounds like what shows up in, a science journal. So it's that kind of dynamic that we need to be mindful of.
Oh, I don't know why. Is anybody
Sorry.
else? Oh, okay. I was like, wait,
Sorry. I have a double mute thing that I do, and I was on the wrong cycle. So, all right, we're gonna sink into one particular model for how to do cultural formative assessment that we call self-documentation. It supports very specific goals that relate to equity and justice. So, we're trying to frame science instruction in such a way that's inclusive to the interests and goals of all students and their communities, connect the science students learn in class to experiences outside the classroom and personally and culturally relevant ways, like we saw with Brenda, build on students' experiences with natural phenomena, how they engage in particular practices with their family or friends and how that relates to what we do in the classroom, make connections between everyday and disciplinary knowledge, discourse, and ways of knowing, like we were just talking about, and help students leverage or extend beyond personal identities in relation, extend their personal identities in relation to science or STEM. So Sam coming to realize that his design hobby pursuit was connectable to engineering is an example of that. And it wasn't until he had an elective engineering course in middle school where he saw that connection deeply. So there's lots of different dimensions of this, and we're going to engage in this use a self-documentation process to do this. Self-documentation is kind of one very broadly useful instructional strategy for kind of connecting to interests, experiences, and identities of students, and in a way that makes it visible to the learning community and to educators who then can kind of act on those connections. And so we're going to open up through a worked example that Jeanne is going to put on the table.
Thank you. So as Phil said, we're going to do this worked example of self-documentation or SelfDoc strategy. And this strategy is also outlined in STEM Teaching Tool 31, which we'll put in the chat. And so please do check that out. I found this to be a really useful tool for me as a teacher. And I just want to acknowledge the comment in the chat about the cornerstones of education comes down to recognizing sense making as the primary modality of truly learning. So it really comes down to connecting the individual to engaging with and making sense of phenomenal learning cycles. Thank you so much for sharing that. I agree. So as Phil had kind of framed earlier, the University of Washington researchers partnered with a 5th grade teacher to develop this SelfDoc activity as a part of a project focused on a curriculum adaptation of a microbiology kit. And it is in that South Seattle district that he had described earlier. So the goal was to provide an opportunity to surface the everyday practices of students, their families, and their communities in relation to microbiology, and drive student-led investigations based on questions of interest to them. So just to re-summarize that overview that Phil had given earlier in this session, part 1 of this curriculum was framing around microbiology and community-based health practices with a germ simulation. And this is where they put the community self-documentation interviews at the beginning. And then part 2 is selecting lessons from the MicroWorlds kit, such as microscope use and magnification, and thinking about what is a cell. And in part 3, the students led investigations that were informed by their self-documentation. So they thought about microbes in their school by sampling and studying the microorganisms, beneficial microbes like FAIR test of yeast and yogurt making, hand washing technique FAIR test, and the effectiveness of different green cleaners. And then part 4 was a research project and the development of a public service announcement based on the practices documented in their student self-documentation, as well as scientific research. So students were sent home with cameras and asked to document health practices in their community as a way to bridge the practices of science class and community activities. And so you can see here, they had this like comic book little appearing thing where they could share what is happening in the different parts of their life, in their kitchen, in their bathroom, in their backyard. What are the different things that their family is doing to stay healthy? So they used community health practices to guide instruction, as well as the self-documentation technique. And for each image, students identified what was in the picture, where the picture was taken, and what activity the picture explained. And students also wrote about how they understood the activity in the picture to be related to staying healthy or getting well. So they had this table that they filled out, for example, a picture of a bottle of vitamins. It was in their bathroom. They took the vitamin every morning, and they take the vitamin so that their body has everything they need to do its job, even though I don't eat all the type of foods that I should. So just an example of how they might fill out that. And after they did this self-documentation process, the teacher took all of these photos, sorted them, and generated a list of community health practices and topics that involved microorganisms. And this list became the source of possible investigations students would carry out to learn more about microorganisms in their community. Like I shared on that sequence of the curriculum, for example, studying the microbes in their school, the yogurt making, hand washing, and green cleaners.
I think so. Jeannie, can I just pop in? Like, if you go back for the, there is a lot of cultural diversity within this particular community. So this is a largely first generation immigrant community where there are kind of 15 home languages spoken within kind of the population around the school. That said, there isn't like infinite variety in cultural lives of the family. So like these 20 things that lifted off as like the practices that showed up across multiple families became then a way of making it manageable to kind of turn into some of the cultural specifics and then do investigations around that. So like sometimes people react to this approach and saying, oh, there's so much diversity, I don't know how I would ever attend to it. And it's like, well, the idea is like there's maybe a little bit less than you imagine, but then also like there's very specific moves you can make to center some of it in kind of meaningful ways. So you don't necessarily have to like attend to all of it, but like making that cultural move within the community is a really powerful thing for everyone to see kind of how you open up investigations about what is unfolding within that particular community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, so we are just going to stay in our whole group for the moment, but we're going to analyze some student self-docs and look for interests and everyday practices that could be connected to a microbiology of health unit. So you're going to try to identify one or two interest-driven lesson connections or investigations that students could engage in, and whether or not you would want students to scientifically test specific family practices. And we're going to put the slideshow in the chat one more time so that you can have those self-doc pictures opened up in front of you. But these next 3 or 4 slides are going to show you actual student work samples. And so you're going to work through them through the lens of these 2 questions about identifying interest-driven lesson connections, and then whether or not you would want students to scientifically test specific family practices. So why don't we go ahead, Phil. Did you want to?
Yeah, I would just say like one thing we could do, like you can pull open the slides and look, at the particular ones yourself. Or Jeannie, you might just like every 40 seconds or so flip from one slide to the next. So people just kind of use the screen here to kind of make sense of these different pages. Each page is from a different student. So you get 3 pictures, kind of a snapshot into the lives of each student. And so why don't we look for these interest-driven investigations, and we'll come back together after we make our way through them.
Oh, and just so you know, we're on slides 63 through 66, I believe. All right, so hopefully you had some time to look through those examples of student work, and we can just share whole group, if you don't mind, how that went for you, like what cultural practices you saw and what came up as you thought about instructional connections.
I saw a lot of different remedies for having like a cold. Like some people had lozenges or throat candy, I think one of them called it. One of them had like ginger they cut up in their tea. And I think a cool instructional thing would be to like compare the chemistry of those different remedies and see if there's any similarities or what's going on that helps with curing a cold.
Nice. Yeah, that would be really fun.
Weird connection, maybe. My youngest daughter is taking a class that's using Inquiry Hub biology. And so they're doing the unit on antibiotic resistance. So all those connections to what students have been told about washing their hands, and a lot on the washing the hands, or you know, there was little pieces of it here and there. There was all these connections to what they learn about in the unit in terms of you know, keeping down the number of microbes that you're exposed, you know, that get right. So anyway, sorry, it's Saturday. My brain's not really working very well, but
No, it's all good.
You're okay.
Who would have thought that hand washing technique would be quite as salient as it has become? But it is. And this is like
this huge thing. Yeah,
it is huge. And 15 years ago, I was kind of surprised how present it was in the photos from the fifth graders, 15 years ago. But yeah, it's a big thing.
It made me wonder if the teacher had given those as examples, though, of what to document, the cold remedies and hand washing.
There's a whole other story, Kren. I really appreciate you lifting that up. There was like the teachers were on their own journey to understand their own cultural lives. So it took a couple of years for them to see their own life in a cultural way that they then opened up to students. So your question makes me flash back to the examples that they gave the class. And I'd have to go back and look at them, but like they might have pointed in a couple of directions like that. But like they were trying to model for students the kind of thing that they were looking for, and that might have had that kind of effect. That's a good guess.
I just know as a teacher, I'm always very careful of what I give as examples because kids tend to do that. They'll hook onto that and you don't get anything outside of that.
Totally appreciate that. Great.
Thank you. All right, thank you. So now let's think about designing cultural formative assessments and how to overlap curriculum with the lives of our students. So if you're designing a SelfDoc assessment, let's think about how we could draft and refine. And in terms of it, the specifics will depend a bit on the format that you choose. So some instructions for developing a custom SelfDoc assessment task are right here for you. You can think about some sample prompts, like what are things you and your family do to stay healthy? Cultural sources or funds of knowledge, like which groups or individuals in our community engage in systematic design and what do they design? Relating science to a community project, so environmental challenges faced by your community. And then once you think about the prompts, you can select the purpose for the SelfDoc and draft a prompt for it, and then share that draft with your colleagues, review the feedback and revise it. So, lots of different ways that you can sort of launch this activity in your classroom. Other ways that you can do this, thinking about expertise mapping. So I'm just going to click on this link to show you really quick. I've used this in my classroom. It was great. I found that students really liked sharing about themselves. So you can, make a copy of this and kids can think about what they have expertise in and what they would like to develop expertise in. Asking students to map out scientific ideas to everyday instances in their cultural world, such as when they see erosion and deposition in their community, how they see Newton's second law in their lives. And then asking students to document what they find to be interesting in their science investigations, field trips, or guest presentations. So lots of ways that we can get our students' lives onto the table here. Sorry, my computer's. All right. So, oops, I'm sorry. I keep clicking the wrong screen. So other suggested formats besides self-documentation would be periodic surveys to surface instruction-related interests and life experiences to leverage. Exit tickets about engagement and learning. So self-assessment surveys embedded within a lesson, sense-making, interests and experiences. And conversations, just daily conversations to provide time and facilitation for students to make the connections to their daily life. All right.
Yeah, and there are some hidden slides in this part of the PL session that open up these details. So around the different ways to do formative assessment on the last slide, there's a few different work examples. And then in this part, we would actually engage the group in designing a cultural formative assessment that fits into their own instruction. And so like we're opening up this activity. This usually runs for about an hour in a typical, you know, PD session format where they kind of like really think together. Maybe you have teachers who teach the same unit and you can really productively have them collaborate around developing a particular piece. And so we kind of prompt them to think about a particular instructional moment where they think kind of a cultural connection around interests, experience, or identities would be useful. And then like think about like these different goals for using it. And so if you click through, we've kind of hidden out the very detailed prompts for each of the different purposes, but we're kind of opening up here a set of different sample self-documentation prompts that go in the different directions. So if you're trying to do culturally responsive instruction, they're just like the one that we went through today and a couple of the others that that Jeanne mentioned. If your goal is to identify community sources of knowledge that relate to phenomena or a topic, you can actually have students self-document, you know, those cultural assets that are in the community and kind of what do they know about that. If your goal is to relate science to a community project specifically, you can actually have them. So in this particular Seattle context, thinking about like the water quality in relation to kind of the fishing or swimming practices of the families, like becomes a very particular justice issue as they kind of are in this site next to the Superfund River. And so there's all sorts of things that the teachers were doing to like understand how students were understanding and then communicating with their communities about the safety of those practices, given what we know about like the pollution in those particular contexts. You could actually have a goal of establishing a new interest for students. So you can actually a science related interest, so you can actually have them document things and then help resource them because they may be really fascinated about something like perfuming, but they may not see how it connects to something else in science or STEM. So you can kind of do the interest driven support move in that way. Or you can surface student identities and expertise. So we do this with teachers, we do this with researchers, we do this practice with students we work with. Just, you know, and I think a lot of the educators we work with have shifted away from doing the beginning of school year survey of students to doing a self-documentation about like what they are experts in or what they want to learn more about. So it kind of like is this other very rich way to kind of get to know the whole person differently. So if that's of interest, that is a really great use for self-doc.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I did. And I have like a whole first unit activity sort of lesson series. If anybody is interested in that, I can find it after the session.
So as we were thinking through those different dimensions in Resource C, we decided to kind of bundle them together into a new STEM teaching tool. So STEM teaching tools have 58. Basically is like all these different ways to make interest-driven connections in science instruction. And so if the 2-pager that kind of opens up those ideas with examples would be of use, we'll kind of share that link as well, just as another resource to kind of get a more 5D approach to science instruction going within the spaces where you're working. All right. Well, so we have a few minutes actually. So I don't know if people have things that are sparking to mind, how you might use self-documentation in an investigation. But we're a small enough group that people could unmute and just share their thinking about how this might connect to what they do. Or we're happy to kind of field any questions that you might be holding at this point in the unit before we kind of go to wrap up.
I've done things like this over the course of my career, like either having projects based in the school community, because that's accessible to all the students. And that's, I think, an easy entree point for a lot of teachers. And then also I've done variations on, having them bring their home experience into what we're learning about. But now as a TOSA, my thing is, how do I help other teachers bridge into these practices? Because one of the pushbacks I get is the amount of time it takes.
Yeah, really appreciate that. I do think, what we have found working kind of across a broader number of teachers in Seattle public schools is kind of an incremental uptake of the practice. And we do often recommend the kind of expertise mapping use as an early one, just because it's very reliable to like help you better understand the diversity of the students that are coming into your space and what they care about and what they know about. And so I'm like flashing to particular examples where people are like, oh, I didn't realize that this young person I was teaching was a tap dancer. And like that like piece just opened up a whole different part of their relationship in a very actionable way. I think beyond that, then trying to think about the very particular spaces where like indexing the cultural lives of students becomes like really important to then figure out where to go in instruction. Like a more high leverage use of self-documentation would be like the second place to recommend, just because then they can, see how it could directly, bring relevance to the instruction they're doing. I am completely sympathetic to the time demand question. I think one thing we saw is that once teachers started making this move and finding their way into supporting students around their cultural investigations, the teachers could share with each other. Because like we had, an entire district that was teaching kind of a culturally relevant approach to a unit, and you start to kind of have some shared kind of synergies across that work across different places. So it's very similar to kind of like then form kind of sharing groups during the PD time, if such a thing exists in your space at this point. So some quick thoughts. I wonder if Jeanne has other thoughts, or other folks here have done similar things with teachers.
I just wanted to give space in case anybody wanted to jump in first, but I think that for me, the way that I was able to do it was like, I did it as a part of my intro unit, and it replaced what might be like a traditional scientific method unit or something. And so I felt like I had space in the curriculum because I felt like these activities had more power than any intro to scientific method unit that I would have done. So that was kind of how I addressed it. And then I agree, it does take time. Like where I think the pitfall can occur is revisiting it, which I think Phil kind of alluded to, and like not forgetting that you've done those things and holding it in your head as a teacher that your students have these interests. So it's like, how do you keep that as a thread that runs through the whole year? Because once you've done the work, I feel like you can use it for a long time after that, with the expertise mapping anyways.
This isn't in the resource, but Jeanne, you're reminding me, they had an expertise wall that they set up in their room. So basically the individual expertise maps went onto the wall and became like a resource for ongoing thinking about who knows what, about what. And so anyway, just to name that as another way to kind of hold on to it, a very kind of material way to hold on to it.
I could totally see that. And then like at the beginning of every unit maybe, or every week or something, you're like, what experts do we have in the room? Like, let's look at our board and see like who might know some interesting things about this topic. But then the other, thing that I was thinking about is like, to Corinne's point about what they write down on these things, like encouraging kids to recognize what expertise is, I think is a big deal, because they're like, I'm not an expert at anything, like, and seeing like that they bring a lot to the table that you would be surprised about. So you have to really like encourage them.
Can I just say, you also have to encourage teachers often that they have expertise as well. We have a whole other thing that we do around unconferencing with educators to kind of develop bottom-up areas of shared learning and work. And we do expertise mapping at the start of that sequence as well. And in one situation, we were kind of having people document what expertise they bring kind of into the space together. And one of these teachers like pulls me over and says, well, I teach high school anatomy and biology, and for 5 years I was a chiropractor, and I don't know, should I name that as an expertise? And it's like, yes, you should name that as an expertise. Like you have like professional knowledge of that directly relates to but I think it's really this pernicious thing in society where we've deprofessionalized teaching to such a degree that people don't want to name the things that they know and know well as expertise. And it happens with kids, but it definitely happens with adults too. So anyway, just
I mean, you saying that is making me think, like, if you're a TOSA, Corinne, like maybe teachers could just engage in this activity themselves. Like,
well, that's totally what I do. I totally model to teachers with them as learners as how I would teach them if they were my students. And and that way it highlights a lot of activities and stuff they can take straight back to their class the next day. But it's just it's hard. This whole culturally responsive teaching. I did a 2-year-long project with the Exploratorium around this specific subject the last 2 years. And there's a touchiness to it. When you start talking to teachers about it, you find sore spots you didn't know were there.
Yeah, for sure. and I think, the way that the world is politicized right now doesn't help at all, because it also just adds to worries of making that cultural personal connection. And, so anyway, I do agree that it is a little bit complicated in that way. Well, we're going to wrap up. I think we're just going to kind of make some final connections here, and hopefully kind of this quote that we started with today, that all science learning can be understood as a cultural accomplishment, has kind of a bit of a more refined focus in your mind as you kind of think about what that looks like within the examples we opened up and the student work for today, and how self-documentation can help surface some of that. So we do think trying to attend to those knowledge bases and connections are really powerful. Thomas Phillip and Flavio Azevedo named these broad science education goals, kind of equity goals for the field. And I think it's useful to think about how the work like cultural formative assessment can be kind of helping us accomplish those, emphasizing this increased kind of as student achievement as a goal. We sometimes talk in very narrow, uniform ways about what that looks like in terms of like being accomplished in understanding science. And I think the cultural variation move of what we've talked about today can help push back on that and to get different images of achievement in play. Second goal around problematizing the privileged forms of science, often, white kind of patriarchal images of science are the ones that we turn around in instruction. And I think kind of cultural moves in the space can help expand what gets counted and who does science, why we do science, who holds science knowledge of what kind. And so that's the second goal. Third goal, focusing science learning on youth and community purposes. Not every piece of instruction throughout the year might make that deep connection, but making those deep, meaningful youth community connections, as often as possible at least a couple of deep times each year, help students see science in context in, for societal purposes, for local purposes, in ways that shift their understanding of what science can be and should be kind of in their life. And then the last piece, they kind of remind us that, science has an important role to play within justice movements specifically. So whether that's around environmental justice or health justice, these kind of cultural dimensions show up within kind of working towards kind of more just, futures. And so it's part of remaking the world in a productive way. And STEMteachingtools.org, we're into year 9, I think, at this point. And these are co-designed by practitioners and researchers and community members in a lot of ways. And we kind of iterate on them. It's, these are your taxpayer dollars hard at work. These are funded through the National Science Foundation projects that we've been part of. And we're just trying to kind of resource professional learning and teaching around the framework for K-12 science ed vision as best as we can. If those are all there for you to use, and if there are other things missing from the collection, we certainly, invite those ideas or contributions to the collection.
Thank you so much. So I also thank you for your time. Corinne, thank you for your kind comment in the chat. If you could take 5 minutes to answer the survey questions that we will put in the chat here. It helps us improve the resources, but that really does make my Saturday to hear you say, Corinne, that you feel like it's going to have a big impact on your teachers and students. So thank you so much.
I have to say, I used almost all or shared almost all of the SIM teaching tools that came up today with the PD I was involved with this summer. On equity. It was like, oh, I guess I picked the right ones. Well,
that's great.
I went to the equity list to start with, so I'll be fair about that. But
that's really great to hear. And so we are always looking for new ones. We have we kind of were just reviewing kind of the next 10 that are on deck for publication. So the effort is unfolding, and we're going into, if you've looked at STEM Teaching Tool 71 that lays out 7 different equity projects, we're developing resources around all 7 of those projects right now. So stay tuned for more is the short answer. But it's great that you're finding them useful, all of you.
Thank you so much for all the work you do. I use your resources all the time.
That's fabulous. And that's why they're there. So we appreciate hearing that. And so thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.
Thank you all.
Take care.